Welcome to this explainer. When we think about the massive, complex machinery of modern executive branches, the huge departments, the intricate chains of command, the delicate balance of delegated authority, it's super easy to just assume that this is all a purely modern invention. We kind of tend to believe that the sophisticated bureaucratic structures we rely on today were born out of the industrial age or modern constitutional conventions. But what if I told you that the precise architectural blueprint for today's executive government was actually mapped out centuries ago? Today, we are going to trace the DNA of modern executive structures straight back to classical Islamic civilization. It is a completely fascinating journey of institutional evolution that shows us just how universal the mechanics of power truly are. So how exactly does ancient government machinery map onto today's modern executive bureaucracy? I want you just to imagine the daily mechanics of a modern government for a second. Picture the bustling executive offices, the secretaries of state, the chiefs of staff, coordinating just a vast array of information for a head of state. Now, get ready to be surprised, because we're going to reveal that this exact systemic blueprint, literally the very rules governing who executes policy and who takes the fall when things go wrong, existed centuries ago. Sure, they operated under different names, absolutely, but the mechanical logic driving them was remarkably identical to what we see today. To unpack all of this, we'll first define the role of the executive minister. Then we'll look at the strict limits of their power. After that, we'll map these historical concepts directly onto modern governments. And finally, we'll break down the systems of accountability. All right, let's jump right into part one and actually define the core functional role we're talking about here. The foundational concept here is the Wazir Al-Tanfidh, or the executive minister. Now, this office wasn't designed for dreaming up new laws or shaping some grand independent strategy. Instead, it functioned purely as a governmental mediator. Its authority was strictly restricted to carrying out the judgments and the directions that came down directly from the head of state. So the role was intentionally designed strictly for the execution of affairs, not for independent policymaking. And that is an incredibly important distinction that fundamentally shaped how historical executive power flowed from the top down. Moving right along to our second section, let's look at the strict boundaries placed on this administrative role to prevent any executive overreach. Classical jurisprudence actually outlined incredibly precise duties to keep this role strictly administrative. Basically, they acted as a vital mediator between the leadership and the subjects of the state. They were tasked with carrying out commands and enacting policies that had already been decided upon by the head of state. They were also the public face for announcing governmental appointments, as well as the military preparations of armies, and crucially, they acted as the institutional eyes and ears of the leader, meaning they informed the head of state of any new developments or important events happening within the realm. Every single one of these functions is deeply administrative. The power is deliberately narrow, designed to keep the machinery of government moving without ever usurping the ultimate authority. What's really interesting here is how linguistic precision was key. The actual title of minister, or wazir, was strictly reserved for those who actually shared in making judgments and organizing affairs. If the role was restricted to strictly executing orders without organizing them, classical scholars insisted on titles like mediator, al-wasita, or ambassador, al-safara. It's honestly a brilliant way to use language to enforce constitutional boundaries. An office is exactly what its job description says it is. No more, no less. Okay, in our third section, we are going to bridge the gap and directly translate this ancient civic architecture into the exact terms we use today. Let's quickly trace how these institutions evolved over time. Back in the classical era, government departments, which were known then as diwans, functioned without a clear, formalized distinction from the central executive office. The administrators simply mapped to all parts of the government machinery. Fast forward to the modern era. Taking the United States as a primary example, it actually wasn't until 1939 that the modern executive office was formally created to organize the immediate central staff. Today, we see a very formal separation between the central executive office and the various executive departments. Yet, despite this modern formalization, the underlying functional roles remain strikingly similar to the classical era. And the translation into modern equivalents is just striking. For instance, the historical role of the hijib, which was basically the doorkeeper who managed access to the leader and coordinated central operations, is the exact structural equivalent of a modern White House chief of staff. Meanwhile, the Sahib al-Karaj, the administrator in charge of state revenues and land taxes, that maps flawlessly to the modern role of Treasury Secretary. We've totally changed the job titles, for sure, but the structural blueprints of the bureaucratic machine are practically identical. How this builds into the everyday practice of power is really fascinating. You see, even if an executive minister heads an executive department, their level of practical power relies entirely on the management style of the head of state. And this perfectly mirrors modern executive administrations. If you have a hands-off head of state, well, department heads might execute policy with minimal daily oversight, taking a much more active role in operations. But if you have a hands-on head of state, those exact same department heads have zero independent executive power. They literally have to secure explicit, direct sign-off from the leader before implementing any executive policies. The structural framework seamlessly accommodates both styles, just exactly as it did centuries ago. Now let's move into our final section and see how this historical blueprint brilliantly solves the universal problem of government accountability. Historical texts on Islamic jurisprudence actually made a really profound observation about their own legal frameworks, pointing directly to their flexibility and suitability for all times and places. And honestly, when you see a millennium-old text map flawlessly onto a 21st century executive branch, it's pretty hard to argue with that sentiment. It was quite simply an institutional design built to endure. To really understand accountability here, let's contrast two major systems. In a parliamentary system, think of models like the historical Egyptian or English constitutions, the ministry holds total responsibility for the government's actions, which leaves the head of state completely immune, protected, and untouchable. But in an executive system, much like the US Constitution, the dynamic flips entirely. The head of state assumes ultimate responsibility, and the ministry is completely subordinate to them. So the absolutely crucial point here is this. The historical executive ministry, that Wazir Al-Tanfidh we've been decoding today, perfectly mirrors the modern executive system. Because the executive minister is strictly a mediator executing orders, they cannot be held ultimately responsible for the policy itself. The buck stops at the top. The head of state assumes full, unshielded responsibility for the direction of the government, while the ministers are accountable only for how well they execute those directions. It's a remarkably clear line of accountability that cuts right through the usual bureaucratic confusion. So we've unpacked the ancient origins of executive ministers, their strict operational boundaries, and how these concepts seamlessly mirror our modern governments today. And I think this forces us to ask a much bigger question. If a centuries-old bureaucratic blueprint has proven this resilient and adaptable across vastly different eras and technological ages, how might its inherent flexibility inform the future of global governance? As we build the political systems of tomorrow, maybe the best place to look for structural inspiration isn't just forward, but back to the architectural foundations laid down centuries ago. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and I really hope this gives you a whole new lens through which to view the corridors of modern power.